Hello, welcome to another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. Slightly different setup today. You'll see that we are in a grid. We are joined by our guest straight from the off. We're not going to be doing that little ramble that me and Steve do for a little bit. We're excited to have two guests, not from this side of the pond, but connected as Brits somehow. There's a connection to Wigan near where I live, to at least one of them. So we're super pleased to be joined on this episode by Brian and Daphne. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute, but thank you so much for joining us. We are very, very grateful for your time. What time is it over there in your neck of the woods?
It's 12:38.
12:38. So it's like they're about 5 hours behind us. Or we're 5 hours in front, whichever way we want to look at it. So, well, we're very, very grateful for you joining us. As we've talked about before, we're passionate about people, speaking to people who are keen on driving the future of education. You've been in this space for a long time and trying to do things a little bit different than what's been the norm, right? So we are super excited to hear that. So Brian, would you just give us a bit of intro to you, and then Daphne, you can tell us a little bit about your backgrounds too.
Sure. I'm a self-taught coder. Taught myself how to program in high school. Is my audio okay? Taught myself how to program at the turn of the century when I was graduating high school. And I ended up in the education space, ended up as a classroom teacher in elementary school. 5th grade's where I started, grade 5 here in the province of Ontario, Canada. And, because we teach to our strengths, coding is something I've done in my classroom since day one. My undergrad's computer science. I have a master's in math, as we all know. There's a massive overlap there. Admittedly, I grabbed my surfboard around 2007, jumped on the hour of code wave. That's not true. The consulting wave came at me in full force, like... This person's been in the classroom doing coding for 10 years. Let's pick his brain. And I ended up in higher ed, never left. And now we do some consulting work in Codebreaker, and we speak all over the planet. And we're just trying to do what's best for kids all over the place by crushing it and breaking codes and challenging norms and pushing back against the way things have been done. It's fascinating to me to watch the evolution of this, because coding came and went so bloody fast. And now we're here talking about AI. But if you just blank out AI, we're having the same bloody conversations here 5-10 years later. We've just replaced coding with AI. And that just means my consulting work's going to continue. So let's go.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thank you. So we'll get into why Codebreaker and which codes need breaking at some point, I'm sure, in the conversation. Daphne, thank you for joining us. I know that you've worked with Brian for a little while. It'd be cool to talk about how that introduction happened as well, but give us a little bit of background to you and how you got to doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I've been in education here in the province of Ontario for, this is actually my 19th year in education. I have spent the majority of my career in the K-3 space. And I've always sort of had a passion for technology and STEM learning before it was really, a big part of our education system. And so about 7 years ago, I started introducing code and more sort of hands-on STEM to the students that I was teaching. At the time, it wasn't a curriculum expectation in our programs. So I was sort of trying to find ways to learn myself and how to do that. So I was at a conference one day, and somebody at that conference knew Brian from his network of people. And so I started actually presenting at conferences while I was teaching, and I was presenting on integrating STEM and specifically coding and robotics into the K-3 program. And then through sort of that network, Twitter's a small world in the education space. Brian reached out to me. He had heard my name at another conference, and through sort of 6 degrees of separation, that network, that small network, Brian reached out, and our sort of relationship started when he asked if I wanted to write a blog post for his website about coding in kindergarten. I was teaching kindergarten at the time, and I was using a lot of code throughout the program. So that's sort of how our conversation started. And then from there, I was still teaching in the classroom. Brian was starting the publishing arm of Codebreaker. And he had asked if that was something that I was interested in writing a children's book. And I had been, I just didn't really know what that looked like, or you know, how to kind of accomplish that. And his piece of life altering advice for me was, you just start. So that's what I did. So I started writing what is now a 3-book Gracie series. And Gracie is about a little girl who was disinterested in learning, and really sort of disinterested in school, until her teacher introduced her to a robot, and she learned how to code, and was able to kind of bring her imagination to life, and then just grew from there. So Gracie started off as 1 book and has now turned into 3. There is a 4th one on the horizon. The 2nd book in this series, actually, Brian and I co-wrote together, and it's a nonfiction piece. The 1st and 3rd are fiction. They're, you know, read alouds that you would have in your K to 3, 4-ish classroom. And the 2nd book is called What Happens When I Learn to Code. And it more speaks to the sort of soft skills on what coding does for our students, you know, like how it makes us risk takers and problem solvers and collaborators, and just really looking at coding more than, you know, math, and more than science, and more than curriculum, but really how it makes us thinkers, and why that's important. So I was doing that while teaching. I hopped on to Codebreaker as an editor. So I was doing that sort of before and after my day job, while writing my own, and still speaking at conferences. And then I left the classroom actually in January of 2022. I left the classroom to pursue writing and Codebreaker full time. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm writing my own stuff in the background. I work as the managing director for Codebreaker, which includes editing, full-time editing for all of the books that we are putting out. And then I also travel right now through North America, speaking at conferences and working and teaching in schools, specifically coding and robotics and STEM learning. I work, you know, directly with teachers, with districts, and also with kids right on the floor of their classroom. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and kind of building my Gracie empire in the background.
Love it, love it. And I know Steve wants to come in with a question and thought, and I think it's worth just putting that conversation in before Steve. I know he's going to dig into something there about. I've got a feeling where he's going to go. But I was introduced to you two, just to give a bit of context to ring it right round, by Adam Hill, who is one of the authors from Codebreaker. I've written a book, and I was looking to think about how that would be published. Introduced by Adam to you two, and my book is going to be published through Codebreaker with Brian and Daphne. So that's how this conversation works. But it's interesting how I said to you both privately in a conversation that I've had conversations with other publishers, thought about self-publishing, and it's about alignment, right? So knowing people who are trying to push down the right kind of disruption, but not disruption that's just about causing a havoc. It's about people who are trying to really do something different for young people and for teachers and for the system. And so when we had that first conversation about publishing my book, it was like, I can't believe these things land. How do these things align like this? Because I've been trying to make this happen, and then it just happened. So yeah, it's fantastic to be working with you about getting that out, but also seeing the passion that isn't just, this is a publishing company to do X, Y, and Z. It's a publishing company that's still got authors at the heart, still trying to do what you're trying to do. So, Steve, sorry, I rambled on a little bit.
It's all right. You delayed my ramble. So how dare you delay my ramble? No, the Rosie, or Gracie, should I say, sounds fascinating. Love it. And the reason why
Rosie's your dog. You can't. You've got Rosie and Gracie wrong, but Rosie is your dog. Right?
No. So Gracie is what we're going to be discussing, and Daphne's steps into it. But I have a little girl, as everybody knows on the podcast, and Brian and Daphne definitely do now, because I said it at the beginning before we came on. And when we went to Canada, good friends of mine over there, Jess Swanson and the family gave us a book, and it was Rosie Revere, Engineer, and my daughter is obsessed with that book. So I think breaking down those boundaries and basically telling young girls and people about the steps into what the art of the possible is. I'm all for it. Absolutely love it. Grace is an interesting one because there's about 5 girls on my street that my daughter Ella knocks around with called Gracie, and they're all called Gracie. I'm like, can you find friends that are not Gracie? So you've definitely picked a strong name, especially that's going to attribute to the British brand as well. I think it's a popular name in the last couple of years, but absolutely love it. And my interest is to both of you of that entrepreneurial spirit. How do you step in? Because there's so many educators that want to be hustlers and having side hustles and doing different things, but there's a fear. Maybe there's a shackles from some of the leadership and some of the parameters that we've put that they can't do different things and they have to let people know and they can't be a teacher in this. But I'm just interested in that step into that you've both made, that for a long period of time you have still been educators, but you've been publishers and you've done coding and you've been speakers and all that kind of thing. How did you step into it, and what advice would you give to anybody that's listening that then says, obviously with the authority and the support from your leaders and the people that look after you in your education, don't just do it, but just do it actually and ask for for forgiveness after.
Yep.
But how did you take that step, and what is the first step into it, do you think?
I can start. I think that the times have changed since I started, since I got into it. It was a very gray area, and I was not afraid to push. I in many ways pushed rules that weren't rules at the time, that might be rules today, so to speak. You know, we all used our cell phone as a hotspot to circumvent filters to show YouTube to our kids. We all did that in 2005. You know what I mean? So we were always ahead of that curve. There was a policy made for teacherpreneurs, and a few friends of mine used to joke it was the Brian Aspinall policy written after I left. I say this because I'll start with go and do. And there isn't a great leader out there that's going to want to push back on the things that you're doing. You do have to have clear communication with people around the ownership of intellectual property. If it's created during the time of day, if it's created at home as a public employee, publicly funded employee, who owns that material? There are a lot of things to navigate, and most districts I've worked with have those policies in place just to protect everybody. It's not a fear thing, like don't go out and be an entrepreneur as a teacher. It's a conflict of interest thing, and there's a lot of legalities in there, and we need to be mindful of it, because it's a new industry. And I think we are sort of paving the way for the teacher entrepreneur, at the turn of the century, before us. Let's go back, Seymour Papert in 1960s and Logo. Let's go back. This goes back a long time. But as an industry now, it's become a thing. If you aren't a teacher speaker, I don't follow you on Twitter. Everybody and their grandma's a teacher speaker on Twitter these days. But my advice to somebody getting started is to simply dive in, start doing it, have the conversations with your administrator, because the reality is you're strengthening the communications with parents by providing that level of transparency into your classroom. If you get pushback, there are bigger problems at your school than you trying to hustle. Daphne?
Yeah.
So on that note, so my Brian was a huge inspiration for me to take that risk. So, and please let me know. I don't know if
I
if
can
I
finish
have a
that
strong
sentence.
connection, if I'm freezing or if
Inspiration
you are
for-
freezing. So I'll keep talking just in case it's not me.
No, you're good.
It's you.
It's me.
It's not us, it's you.
I'm sitting next to my router. I don't know what else to do. I'll just hopefully it works. Here we go.
So it's just we're talking about breaking codes. We're
right.
That's what we're doing right now, right?
And here we are. So I was always of the mindset that you kind of became a teacher. You did that forever. And then you left, and sort of you retired in that way. And if anything, maybe you became an administrator, and that was it. You became a teacher, you retired a teacher. That end. So I didn't really. I saw through social media what other people were doing in their lives, and how there were teachers who were speaking and teachers who were doing more than just teaching. And I was always of the mindset, that was something I'd love to do, but that's not for me. Like I can't do that. There's no reason. That just wasn't what I would do. I wanted to. And then I started seeing more through social media, like on Twitter, about, what other educators, mostly in the US, were doing. And I don't know if I'm still frozen there. I think I'm back. I'm sorry. I saw what a lot of other educators were doing, and I kind of started to look into, hey, what might this look like for me? And then, while I was teaching, I was doing all of the Gracie writing and marketing and all of that stuff before and after school. Like my days started at 4 a.m. so I could get 3-4 hours of work done before the school day started. I was working through my lunch hour, and then I'd work after school for 3 or 4 hours, plus a full day of teaching first graders. It was exhausting. So, slowly moving towards burnout, but also, kind of on the way discovering a different passion that I didn't have. So, or that I didn't know existed. So the only real advice I guess I can really give is to just do it. And I know it's not that simple. I know that, you need to have certain finances in order, and you need to have certain, things in your life in order. Like I was very lucky to be in a place in my life where I could take a year off to see what this looked like. I know that that's not necessarily something that everybody
I think she's
can do.
referring to taking time off
But
to
it
join
started,
Codebreaker full time.
it started at 4 a.m.
When she
before the school
exited
day
her
started.
classroom.
It started at 3 p.m. when the school day was. Did you hear any of that?
Yeah, so it's all good. It'll pull together afterwards. It's all good. So you were talking about how you were talking about joining Codebreaker because there's a difficulty there, right, in terms of doing both things at once and burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, like I was privileged enough to be able to take that leave so that I could, start to, begin my journey as an entrepreneur without that, that paycheck that was coming every 2 weeks. So I was lucky in that regard. But until I was able to do that, it was something that I had to start at 4 a.m. and finish at 8 p.m. There were a lot of sacrifices that I had to make because this was something that I really wanted to do. And it was something that I chose to do. And so it's, and it's something that I'm really proud of that I've done to this point, and what I've built with the Gracie brand and with the Codebreaker brand and with, Brian as a mentor and friend. So I've definitely, learned a whole lot on this sort of journey of where I was to where I am today. So.
Yeah, I love it. And I love the fact that it's not a done deal. Like, it's interesting that phrase that you were talking about there, that people think that they've got to be teachers for life. And we all know those people that are still in that space. And there are some people that will be that. But Steve regularly quotes this stat that says that the average graduate now is going to have 7 million jobs and 4 side hustles and whatever else it is, 17 jobs, I think it is. But that principle of that ability to be agile and pivot, and the advice that you've given there for people, because there are a lot of people that are asking for that. Well, is this all there is? Do I have to do this till? And there's also that thing of the Peter principle that we talk about all the time, right? So people get a really good teachers and then become assistant principals, or they become heads of division or whatever else it is, and they're not very good at managing budgets and staff and whatever else, but they're really good at classroom stuff. So you get promoted to that level of incompetence. And so actually sometimes it's not always about moving. It's moving up the chain, so to speak. It might be sideways moves and whatever else that's sitting there. And I think what's kind of inspiring in that space is that it makes a lot of sense why you called the organization Codebreaker. And I know that there's more than a little of a nod towards the fact that you're doing code and coding and STEM and all that important stuff that sits in that space. But you've obviously called the brand CodebreakerEDU, and that's intentional, right? So I wonder if, Brian, you could maybe, I know you've talked a little bit, maybe talk at that a little bit, why you went CodebreakerEDU and what that really means as a movement.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Alan Turing, right? The original OG codebreaker, who was deciphering code during the World Wars. created his own programming language. So it's a bit of a nod, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants, and we want to be the code breakers of the 21st century. But also, it's evolved with me. I'll be honest, Codebreakers started as my own passion project. It was my side hustle when I was a teacher, and has become my main sort of hustle. And teaching's become my side hustle now in the higher ed space. But the idea of getting kids to code, that was my push throughout the 2000s. 2005, when I started teaching, to practically up to and including the pandemic, was that push for new computer science curriculum. Following everything you gents were doing with the microbit in the UK, how do we get more of these devices into kids' hands? And it then evolved from there, because I was like, I love what I do. But I started to see the entry point to coding was mathematics and older kids. And then it started to trickle down. And I'm a grade 7 and 8 teacher, so I hit at the right time. Everything's right place, right time. I'm not like Mr. Progressive Teacher of the Year. I had a computer science degree. I'm male. I got into elementary school at the right time. Let's be honest, okay? But the evolving from just the coding consulting work happened when we really took a step back and realized that there's more to it than this. If you've ever used Scratch in a Classroom, which is a 22-year-old program about teaching kids to code, you'll understand that the geometry is rooted in it naturally, and you're teaching kids the fundamentals of mathematics without a textbook or a worksheet. And that's when it dawned on me that Codebreaker was about pedagogy. It was bigger than simply teaching kids to code. When kids learn to code, it never works the first time through. And that forces us to reevaluate mistakes at school and what it means to fail at school. Failure's been something traditionally that we punish, we hurt kids for, we make them stay in at recess. Well, in a math world, in a coding world, that's where we create the phobias. That's where math anxiety comes from. Time testing environments where mistakes are the problem, and we as human beings don't want to be identified as dumb. So we want to avoid those sort of situations. Breaking code became that metaphor for disruption in all facets of the system. You could be a primary school coder like Daphne. You could be a middle school coder like me. You could be a superintendent code breaker like half the other people on our roster that are just doing amazing things for the students in their classroom. The idea is that coding worked for me, and it's like broccoli. You don't know if you like it till you try it. But also, I get to continue to, for life, model my own passion project, document it on YouTube, where I also monetize my portfolio of learning. You want to talk about hustling as educators? We all make our students have portfolios, but none of us do. Well, I make money off of mine. It's right there on YouTube, and anybody can go, take a peek at it. So code breaking, at every level of the system. The brand admittedly started as a computer science consulting organization and has evolved into what it is today. And I couldn't be more proud of the work that everybody has done.
I just wanted to add something to that. Brian said, shout out to Alan Turing, the original Codebreaker. And I just want to say that Bill Nye's mom also worked on the Enigma code. So maybe she was the original Codebreaker.
She was. It was her. It was her.
Just putting that out there. I think I just took a second to Google it to make sure my facts were correct. And I just want to put that out there.
I hear Corbin's hiring.
They can't afford me.
Wow. So breaking codes, doing things in a different way, looking at things from a variety of viewpoints, and realizing that we don't have to do it just because we've always done it this way. It doesn't mean that's the way we've always got to do it. I love that. I love that idea that that's in the DNA of what you're trying to do as an organization. And it's also in the DNA of what you are doing with the authors and the books and the things that are going in that space. Just before we get into that and some of your awards and some of the things that you've done, I wonder if you're quite the person, right, when it comes to TEDx talks, Brian. Is that yeah? And Daphne, I know you're all over videos here and podcasts there and speaking here. Maybe when you look at that some of the titles that sit in there, beyond rote learning, hacking the classroom, reform like them kind of conversations, they are. We're saying we can't stay this way, right? We've got to do something different. So I'm I'm guessing the message is relatively relatively clear. But why do you think we don't need rote learning anymore? Why do you think we need to hack a classroom?
Who are you asking?
I'm asking you, Brian. Sorry, I'm asking you first, Brian. Sorry.
Here's the thing. As I said in my first TED Talk, Beyond Rote Learning, I can't believe that was a decade ago. I don't know what happened. I said in the TED Talk, most of the TED Talk I disagree with today. But there is one thing I do believe in wholeheartedly, and that's the idea of rote learning still is incredibly important. The problem that I see it, as I see it, is we continue to evaluate rote learning. That's where it falls apart for me. You're not going to program in Python if you don't know the syntax. If you have to memorize the syntax, memorize the syntax. Just like you have to know how to take apart the engine if you're a mechanic. You have to know the inner workings of that. You have to. Doctors, when they're on demand in the middle of ER, don't have time to Google something. They have to know. But when we continue to evaluate students on their ability to memorize spelling, that's where it falls apart for me. It's not that we don't need regurgitated rote learning in classrooms. It's we don't need to evaluate students' ability to produce content in that kind of an environment, because that reflects a sort of industrial world that just doesn't exist.
Coming in. I'm here. Can you hear me? Yeah, absolutely love that. I think it's that whole thing of, we're not saying everything is broken. What we're saying is it shouldn't the be all and end all. Some of these things are still needed. The curriculum is still there, but ultimately we need to navigate, add, and evolve that curriculum. But we need to do it pretty quick, because it's not evolved significantly enough over the period of time. Like you say, you did that TEDx talk 10 years ago, Brian.
Something like that, yeah.
How far have we developed since then? That's the frustrating bit. You're saying you don't believe, and ultimately 10 years ago we've not moved anything forward. We're still having people and governments and processes and policies and systems that are, and just saying continue to do that. I was at a conference yesterday and there was some great stuff. There were some rewarding bodies there, and ultimately I'm speaking specifically for England, but it probably transcends across the rest of the world, where they kept saying the current government wanted it done this way. The current government believe that exams and written exams are the way, and these the summative assessments and that's the challenge with education, because we're not globally to have the vision, because things are done on policy that only lasts for a short period of time. We don't set the vision to say this is where we're going to go because this is what we believe education to be. We put something in place and say this is how we're going to win some votes and elections. Cycle of not really evolving. It's based on financial. It's based on governments. It's based on policies and systems, because they can demonstrate. And I think the world is and England is probably a good benchmark of when a government wants some money and wants to change something. They go into the treasury and they say, if you give me this amount of money, I will be able to demonstrate this. And whether that's an improvement in, let's say, the amount of roads you're going to lay, whether that's the amount of train track you're going to do, whether that's the amount of grades or increasing grades or something tangible that you're going to be able to do. Or we're currently sitting here in terms of a PISA table, we'll get you up to 8 from 10 and all that kind of thing. That's the problem, because ultimately they want to demonstrate that from that investment, they've got a tangible thing. And education isn't like that. We can't stand up for all of these developments in terms of skill and say, look, a certificate I've got on it, because it's a competency thing, rather than actually the way that we've formed exams and assessment. And it's such a challenge because it's longer than 10 years. Brian, you've been talking about this for a long period of time. I've been through an education system and secondary school. I left I think I was pre-millennia. My memory is terrible. But ultimately, nothing changed. But my schooling system was outdated then, in my belief, when I look back at it. And that was 30 years ago and more, and we're still doing exactly the same thing. It's such a shame, isn't it? So we need people that are going to shift it up and change it. And we need, I think, the stuff that you're doing in regards to the slasher model of I am this /this/this/this/this. Ben talked about that stat that 17 jobs, 5 careers, 2 side hustles in a lifetime of a Gen Z now. That's the statistic. But when we look at it, I think we have to, and it might help the teacher crisis and the recruitment crisis and the retention, because ultimately, if we allow them to develop themselves outside of the classroom, it will probably retain them. It will give them extra source, and it will also open their eyes to then change the systems within it to then say, I've seen the world and we're teaching something that's really beyond it. But a lot of them are career teachers generally. And that's a shame because they haven't seen the world of what they're preparing the students for. They live in the world, but they've not done a job outside of it generally and everything else. So I think being a slasher really will help and giving people a different string to their bow beyond just a pension.
I love that they've called it slasher. I love that they called it slasher because that means a totally different thing, right? That we want children to become slashers. I'm not entirely sure that we should be, but become
something
a slasher.
Something. A hustle. Yeah, have side hustles, do multiple things, be an entrepreneur. I'm not saying if you're a passionate teacher, it's absolutely fine if that is your aspiration and what you want to do for the rest of your life. It's absolutely fantastic. Even if it's not paid and it's just something as a side hustle or volunteering or charity or something outside, to really have a sense of what the world is like now, and even for leaders, because ultimately they're preparing and they're making it on a judgment that was probably from the 80s or the 90s, pre-internet in terms of the world. They still wear ties and shirts and ties. It still makes me chuckle.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Interesting.
So don't be a slasher, just have a side hustle.
Interesting in that space.
I'll clear that.
As well, is that I'm thinking, obviously, Daphne, you're coming from that young, really young age, first time they're going into a formal education. Let's also call a spade, which is that learning doesn't start when they arrive at kindergarten or nursery. Like it's been happening forever, but how that's happened, it might be different for different ages and different types of kids and whatever else. But a lot of the reform or the push that people are talking about is let's get rid of exams, and other people are saying, okay, let's do project-based learning, or let's reform the universities and make sure that they're ready for skills and this and that and the other. But you've been working right at the grassroots. As soon as they come in, really, really malleable, pliable young children, and you've been trying to do some work in terms of like reform and change and doing it differently there. That's really powerful, right? How did you do that? And then also that ties into that, what can we learn from the littlies that we probably need to learn and drive out throughout education?
So I'll answer that question first. We can learn everything from our kindergarten friends. So when I started my career, I started in grade 3, which is those kids come to me at 8 and they leave when they're 9. Slowly, as I went through my career, I started teaching lower and lower. So I went from 3 to 2 to 1, and I spent about 6 years in grade 1, which I loved. But what I was noticing at the time was that I was getting a lot of kids who were coming to me in grade 1 after our provincial kindergarten program changed. So many years ago, we had what we would call junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten, and it was a half-day program. So essentially, they were in kindergarten for 2 years. They start in the province as long as they turn 4 by the end of the calendar year, then they can begin kindergarten. So you have some kindergartners at the time were starting at the age of 3. Maybe they were going to be turning 4. As long as they turned 4 by December 31st, they were eligible to begin kindergarten. And so they would come for 2 years and they would spend half a day in school. And then our program changed to what they called at the time a full day kindergarten. So they are then our kindergartners, same age, but rather than splitting up our junior kindergartners with our senior kindergartners, we put everybody together, and we called that year 1 and year 2. So in one classroom, and the ratios also changed significantly. So in one classroom in your 6-hour school day, there was an average of 30 to 35 kindergartners, all ranging from the age of 3 to 6. All coming to you at massive developmental stages that could have been very, very different. And because they're coming at you so young, there is we had a lot of students who may or may not have been sort of, undiagnosed, perhaps on the spectrum or anywhere in between learning. And so they were, often coming to us. We might have students on the spectrum who we were not, sort of on paper, that wasn't a thing. And I say that to say that, so, to understand that the range of learners we were suddenly faced with was massive, and they were all in the same space with you. We also increased the ratio. So we had in those classrooms, we have a certified Ontario educator, as well as a certified early childhood educator. And so we were sort of, our expertise was in two different, still working with children, but in two different areas. So when I started teaching grade ones after our program changed, I was really curious as to why the students were coming in so different. And what changed with that full day program is they started to call it a play-based program. And it was my understanding that at the time, it actually came from something based in the UK. It was a program based in the UK that they were doing project-based learning with actual grade 12 students. And they took that same model and brought it to Ontario and started with our kindergarten students. And so there was no more checklists of, they need to know 26 letters and, 10 numbers, et cetera, and these science concepts. It turned into what we call frames. And so suddenly we were not looking at, can they spell their name, but rather, are they showing reading and writing behaviors versus, can they count to 20? Can they recognize these numbers? We now call that mathematics behaviors. And so as educators, we were learning to look at their learning in a completely different way. There was no more checklist of, can they count to 10, yes or no? It's what are they doing that shows that they are learning mathematics concepts? What are they doing that shows that they are understanding, reading? So even something simple as looking at a wall and seeing a logo for McDonald's, if they could say that that was McDonald's, that's a reading behavior. So as educators, we needed to change our own learning and our own understanding of what reading was and what writing was. So I moved into kindergarten so I could understand my grade one students on a different level. So I could understand, sort of where they were coming from and how they were leaving that kindergarten program and then coming back to grade one, where suddenly everything changed all over again. So we have 2 years of kindergarten where there's no grades. It's really just commentary on their learning and what that looks like, to suddenly going into grade one where parents are getting report cards with letter grades. So it's very, very different for our parents, and it requires a very important conversation with our families to help them understand the difference between kindergarten and grade one, just in terms of, what a report card looks like. But the learning, as far as I'm concerned, is still the same, because it's beautiful, rich learning. And what I like, kindergarten, grade one is my favorite place to be, because they've sort of already, been exposed to school for 2 years. And so they understand what the school environment looks like. And they understand sort of the general expectations of what it means to be a student. But I loved kindergarten as well. I loved that they came to you not as a blank slate. They often, people like to say that, exactly what you said, Ben, like they're not coming to you. This is not their first experience in learning, but it is their first experience in school. And so as a kindergarten educator, you get to be the person who gives them that love of learning. And I think that is such an important role to play in what our kids think about learning and what they think about school. Not a lot of people think, oh, it's kindergarten, that's all they do is play all day. And you're right, that's exactly what they do. They do play all day. But what people don't realize is how much learning is involved in play. They don't walk in the door. We don't hand them a bucket of toys and say, see you at 3:00. Everything is an effective kindergarten educator has a method to their madness all day long. And as a result, it is the most exhausting 6 hours of your life forever. But there is a method to the madness of how you introduce learning through play, as opposed to here's some toys, see you later. So, teaching our youngest students, that's where it's so important to teach them how to think, how to problem solve, how to take risks, so that they take it with them as learners, and it becomes a part of who they are versus something that we're trying to teach them how to do in 5 years when suddenly they're faced with a provincial test. If they've been taught how to take risks, if they've been taught how to problem solve in various ways versus just to get a grade on a test or an assignment, it's a game changer for them, and it gives them. And the younger we start with tasks where they are faced with, needing to take a risk, and using their imagination to solve all sorts of unique problems that they can relate to, the more it translates into everything that they do as learners moving forward. I think I answered your question.
I absolutely did. Yeah, you did. You absolutely did. And we love that. We've had a few people on from the Montessori approach, and I know that there's pros and cons and lots of things in that in terms of costs and whatever else. But that principle around play, that principle around there is that exploration and curiosity, and then putting some language towards that says, okay, you're interested in this. How do we explore that? And that level of agency, that level of autonomy, but also that level of curiosity and independence that's going to make students want to learn. I've just been in a school this afternoon. I don't do much student facing stuff anymore, which is the worst thing ever. In fact, I've had 2 hours this afternoon. It's made me go, this is incredible. Why did I leave doing this? And then I saw some of the meetings that were being had afterwards, and I realized that's the reason why I left this.
That's why.
But in front of the 2 hours in front of those young people who were lapping it up because they've got an exam coming up, and so they asked me to go in and do some like intensive stuff to support them with, which is sad, but that's why they brought me in. 2 hours of them young people just lapping this up, and then they're asking questions. What about that stuff you just talked about there? Does that apply here? How could I use that in? What about this answer? Could I use? I've written this before. What would you say? And I just thought to myself, this is what it's about. When there's that level of curiosity, rather than saying the bell goes, now you're in French. The bell goes, now you're in science. The bell goes, now you're in history. Mm-hmm. That level of like child-led learning, that almost continuous provision that they talk about in that early year space is powerful, and that kind of transitions us really nicely into obviously that the curiosity piece that you've done and in schools, both of you, and beyond, has developed into creating an organization that helps other people explore their curiosity. They've got an idea for a book, they've got an idea for this, and then you help bring that to life with that author, right? So you've got a number of authors on the team, and it's interesting how you talk about even the people that are on the team, the way that you give the names that you give to those people, the titles that you give to those people. It's a very interesting thought process, right? It's not, these are our authors, we are the leaders, we'll tell you how this goes. It's not that, and I'd be interested to hear why you've done that. But maybe talk to us a little bit about the books, and I'm happy for either of you to jump in that space. Talk to me about some of the books, the authors, why that's been important.
I happily speak to that. There was a time where I was just sort of done with the consulting work, truthfully. Airports are glamorous for so long, This is sort of pre-pandemic, I guess. I was in Michigan, which is the United States, which is a completely separate country from my own because I live in Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen. I was across the border here. And I was supposed to be the Friday the 13th morning keynote at McCall, the Michigan Association of Computer Users and Learning Conference on March 12th, 2020. And they said, they're closing the borders. The MBA just shut down. You want to get home. And I had already left formal education, right? By then, I was still associated with higher ed, but higher ed doesn't pay the bills the way education does here in Canada. So all my consulting work sort of went out the window on Saturday, March 14th, 2020. I woke up and went, what the heck have I done? I'm a year out of leaving the profession to at home, unemployed and dead broke for the foreseeable future. This is a mess. Anyway, that quick, big story led to also realizing that the push for computer science integration was no longer 7-8 and had become kindergarten. And I realized overnight I'd predominantly become irrelevant, truthfully, right? I've been doing this in grades 7 and 8. And that's when I met Daphne, who obviously could pull in the primary piece. I don't have that skill set. And that's when it dawned on me that Codebreaker is not going to be the quote unquote Brian Aspinall show. I want Codebreaker to be the force not to be reckoned with. That is a collection of educator stories that are just chomping at the bit with passion to go out there and to do these great things. You know, it led me to not turning down PD opportunities, but passing them over to my colleague, you know, and me taking pay cuts so that other people could have opportunities. And really, the pandemic was the nail in the coffin. We had already just started publishing. Pandemic hits, consulting goes out the window. Brian's enrollment goes up, by the way, and I get paid per head. And as a teacher who teaches teachers in university, who teaches tech courses at the beginning of a pandemic, every teacher and their grandma wants to take the introduction to the tech course. In March of 2020, my enrollment went through the roof. In March of 2022, my enrollment was none. People were done with online learning, you know, in a short, quick 2 years. Anyway, that was the pivot where it was I could reach out to all these administrators and district leaders and innovators I've met over the years. Every time I go to a conference and I would sit down and have a drink with somebody, they would tell me their horror story of how somebody took ownership of their blog or they got in trouble for this, that, and the other. And I said, you know what? Not only have I heard this story 1,000,000 times in every school district across North America, I've lived it. I've lived it. That's why I'm standing here. I wasn't forced out of my district, but they didn't make it a fun place to remain. You know what I mean? So the idea of publishing came as a result predominantly of the pandemic and us seeing it turn to virtual learning and being able to do computer science and coding integration via a Zoom call. And it went from there. It was like calling every district leader saying, I love your story. You've got an amazing story to tell. We're all at home for the next 6 months. You're never going to get this opportunity again. Write the book. I have 100,000 followers on social media. Write the book. Nobody said no, right? And so that put together a team of misfits during the pandemic who was doing virtual. We were doing virtual conferences. We had over 150 people sign up, I think, in April of 2020. It was an astronomical number at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, the last piece of the publishing arm goes back to the side hustle and the portfolio of learning. We're encouraging our young people to create portfolios, move away from grades, enter project-based learning. We're encouraging our adults to create portfolios. Here in Ontario, our teachers have to do an annual learning plan where they write off what their goals are for the year. But publishing, it wasn't just an idea to, amplify your message and get it out further. It was to just build your own brand as an educator, modeling that approach. If you're going to have 7 side hustles in your life, the kids in your class are going to have 35. We just don't know. So start modeling that too. So if I can work with an educator to create a book that showcases their body of work, that might evolve into coding courses, that might evolve into their own professional learning, that might evolve into their own keynote speaking. And all of a sudden they have a portfolio that started with an idea, became a conversation in a book, but now they have all of these artifacts. Who needs to write a fucking annual learning plan anymore?
Agreed.
That's American for I love you.
You don't need to apologize for that. We've had Bob Harrison on this court, and you might not know Bob, but Bob, it's pretty much every sentence, and we love it. We need more people who are willing to do that in that space. So, and obviously, Daphne, you're now in that editing space. You've written your own books in that space, and there's loads coming down the line. I see them. I go onto the thing and think, oh, there's another one. Oh, there's a tweet. Oh, there's another one coming. Oh, when does Daphne sleep? Like those things are, in terms of getting things through. So there's loads of kids books in that place. There's the leadership series that help people write things that are going to help with all sorts of improvement or the culture, some of the things that sit around about risk taking and whatever else. Almost everybody thinks they've got a book in them, right? Which I think I would say that most people do have, and
most people have a story.
Yeah. And you said that phrase, didn't you? Brian said to you, you just start. I wonder, Daphne, just how would you advise if somebody's got an idea for a story, for a book, to get into that place? Where would you start? I know you just start, but where would you start?
So when I wrote Gracie, like just speaking from personal experience, when I wrote Gracie, I sort of had the idea of what I wanted to write about. I did a little bit of research. That's the other thing, there are plenty of books out there. So, yours has to be unique in some way. And I know, most of our authors, and I started this way too, we're not writing books to retire on, but hey, if that's an option, I'll take it. Absolutely. Who are we kidding? We have a very famous author here in Canada. His name is Robert Munsch, and every child in every school across the province knows who that author is. And that's what I strive to be. That's what I will one day become, sort of the Robert Munsch of the Gracie world. And so, in order to do that, there is, research that needs to be done. So when I was writing Gracie, there were a lot of books on coding that were starting to come out in the children's book space, in that read aloud space, but there weren't very many about robotics. And so that's why the story of Gracie is about coding, but it's not about, it's not just about coding. There's a robot that she learns to code. And so that robot sort of takes on its own, it doesn't speak, it doesn't do anything. It's a little robot, but it has its own personality, and it's sort of taken on its own little space within the Gracie world. And so, that required some research, that required some thinking. I needed to look into, even naming Gracie. So earlier you said Rosie under Rosie Revere, and that was one of the names that I had sort of thought about at the time. But where Gracie started, she was called Ruby. And doing some research, I discovered that there was an entire coding series about a little girl named Ruby, and so that needed to change. So Gracie is actually named after Grace Hopper, and I did that from a very specific marketing place, because Grace Hopper is a phenomenal trailblazer for women in computer science. And so I get to, not only is she the name of that, but then I get to really focus on powerful women in the STEM field. And so that speaks to, not only does it speak to my brand from a marketing perspective, but it speaks to my beliefs about pedagogy, and it speaks to my beliefs about little girls in our education system and where they start and where they go. So, again, that took some research. And then I sort of just had this idea of what I wanted the story to be about. And I had an idea of where I wanted the story to go. But where I was stuck was how to connect the two. I knew the story, I knew what I wanted to happen in the story, but I didn't know how to make it happen. And so I sort of had to sit on that for a while. So I had the beginning of the story, I had the end of the story, but I had no middle. And you can't force it. As an editor, when I read whether they're children's books or whether they're leadership stories, I can immediately tell when you stopped writing your story and you started rushing to get your project done. I can tell that instantly and I'm not I'm using air quotes, I'm not a classically trained editor. I did not go to school for that, but I know how to read I am an avid reader. And so as an avid reader and somebody in the education space who's reading books about educators by educators, you can tell when somebody didn't put the book down and allowed the ideas to come to them. And so that was something that I had to do with Gracie. I had to do it with the first and the third book. I had to put it down, and until literally one day, it just like a light bulb went off. Not to be cliche, but that's what happened. And I thought, okay, I figured it out. I know how to make the two things connect. And as a result, I've been sitting on my own sort of leadership book that I've been, it's sort of been sitting in my Google Drive for a few years now. But and I add to it as I have stories come and go, but I have evolved so much as a person in the last 5 years that where that idea started feels so distant and so foreign to me today, that if I was to try to, finish the book the way that I had intended 3 years ago when I started it, it would be so disconnected and it just wouldn't make sense. And so that's another thing too, you sort of have to come to terms with as somebody who's writing a book is that's great that you want to write your story, but that's maybe just a blog post versus a book that, everybody wants to pick up and read. So, you start with an idea. That's sort of where it starts. Like, where do I want this book to go? And what do I want that to look like? We've had people come to us with really, really solid research-based books, and they're great if you're into that sort of thing. And that's not really what our brand is about. Our brand is about the story, and our brand. And it's not to say that one book is better than the other. That's not it at all. But the audience that we reach are people who want the stories. They want the inspiring reads. They want to know. My sort of book journey began when I read Brian's Risk Taker. And it was because when I read his book, I finally felt understood as an educator. I finally felt that somebody else had gone through sort of some of the trials and tribulations that I had gone through. And you sort of felt not alone. And, okay, this is what that looks like. And Brian and I, while we live in the same province, we've experienced a completely different life in and outside of education. And yet his words just really, really spoke to me. So from our sort of Codebreaker side of life, we really aim to publish stories, real life stories of people who are willing to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, these are some awful things that I did. I can't believe I still have a job, but here's everything I learned about it. And here's why I'm so much better as a result of all of the mistakes that I made, not the books that say, here's all the bad things that somebody else did to me. And that happens. And, and we all have those moments in our lives, but we're really looking at, our leadership team is filled with individuals who have had struggles that they've learned from and become better as a result of. And that's really, those stories are stories that everybody can relate to, and everybody can, especially in the education space, no matter what you're doing in that education space.
Steve's struggling with unmuting.
Yeah, oftentimes I'm behind everybody else, but what a story, and it really leads into and I don't know whether Ben's give you a heads up. He shouldn't have done. But if you've listened, you already know. In this season, we have 3 quick-fire questions, and it's going to set on all the parameters, all the beliefs, what you've said, and everything else. I'm interested to hear. So we've got 3 quick-fire questions. Daphne will go Daphne, Brian, Daphne, Brian, Daphne, Brian. Take all of the 3 questions in that order. I'll go first with the first question, then Ben, and then I'll finish if that's okay. So, are we ready for it?
Ready.
Futures online traditional scrapped.
So I'm sorry, Steve, you cut out. I didn't hear it.
Sorry, future of exams, online traditional scrapped.
Are those my only 3 choices? The answer is it should be all of it. It should be learner dependent. Option D. I pick option D. All of the above.
Brian?
Okay. Brian?
Retweet. You know what? Coming from a grade 8 teacher who was told for 20 years, officially, unofficially, my job's to prepare kids for high school, I'm going to go with scrap it.
Okay. So, Daphne first again. Key skill that students are going to need in 2040.
They need to be problem solvers. And in order to be a problem solver, you have to be able to... Sucker, I got your answer first. They need to be able to, not to be cliche, but to think outside the box. And the only way to do that is if they're given authentic opportunities to solve problems where they are required to think outside of a textbook or a worksheet or a, sort of typical experience in the classroom.
Love it. You can't just say retweet, Brian.
Based on the last 5 years, and to try and project what the next 15 would bring, I'm going to suggest that in order to be an effective problem solver, you have to be a deep computational thinker. And I think we're going to see more around the mindset of, artificial intelligence, computational thinker. I hate the growth mindset buzzy stuff, but wait, this is a quick thing. Computational thinker. Thinking. Edit. Fuck.
Absolutely not. We're not doing that. Okay, last one. Education in 50 years. What is your vision? Daphne first.
Education in 50 years, my vision is that it is learner focused and play based, play relative to our age.
I will add to that and say that it will be ridiculously immersive in whatever facet of the imagination that means. I think the learning will be we talk about it being interactive today, but we're just scratching the surface, pun intended.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us. Another episode of the Futurist podcast. We are very, very grateful for your time. By the time this goes out, we're probably well underway for Edufuturist Uprising in Leeds. It might well have there's probably all tickets have sold out. So if you're listening now and you haven't bought your tickets, your own silly fault. If there is, and there might be a few left, go to uprising.edufuturist.com. You'll be able to get that. But Brian, Daphne, thank you for joining us on another episode of the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.